Amen. Awesome. So we want to transition right now into a time of teaching, and I want to start today by highlighting a ship. And I'll throw the picture of the ship up on the screen. You might recognize this ship, okay? Well, what's the name of this ship? The Titanic, okay? The Titanic is a very famous ship. At the time of its maiden voyage, it was considered one of the most luxurious water vessels to be put on the sea, okay? It included a gymnasium, a swimming pool, smoking rooms, fine restaurants, and hundreds of lavish cabins, and so much more. The Titanic was considered really advanced, right? Technologically, it was a super advanced ship, and it was super fancy. If you've ever seen pictures, this was a ship, and people wanted to be a part of it. And famously, we know the rest of the story. Okay, go to the next picture. Yeah, Titanic hit an iceberg. Okay, people were living at the height of luxury in this boat, and then out of nowhere, an iceberg comes. And what's fascinating about the RMS Titanic is that it took over 2.5 hours to sink, okay? And you'd think, okay, if a ship is sinking, people are freaking out. And that's true. People are freaking out. But there was also a group of people who were pretty calm, because the staff aboard the Titanic were telling people, hey, it'll be okay. We'll be able to get on a lifeboat. Yes, the ship's going down, but we'll get on a lifeboat. But the thing that no one really thought about was what would happen if we did need all the lifeboats. So you can see the numbers on the screen. Only 20 lifeboats were put on the Titanic. That'd only be enough for around 1,100 to get on lifeboats if they were filled 100%. But we see that most of them were only sent out at 60% capacity, meaning for the rest of the people on board, there's nothing for them to get on. 1,500 people died aboard the Titanic. The reason this is so interesting is because no one on board that ship was thinking, what if this goes down? What if the ship goes down? And even the name of the people that sent it out were the White Star Line. They called it an unsinkable ship. It's funny how God works in that way. And what we see here is we're going to enter into chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians. Go ahead and turn there if you haven't already. We're going to see that pride is something that the church of Corinth has been struggling with. Pride is something that has consumed the church of Corinth. And we are in the midst of our series, Firing on All Cylinders. And in this series, we've been exploring the letter of 1 Corinthians, a letter that Paul wrote to the church of Corinth, a church that he helped establish. And he's writing to them because he noticed that the church of Corinth was living in a way that was more akin to the world than the way that Christ's people should be living. And that's what this book of Corinthians hits. But what we're going to see as we jump into chapter 10 today is that Paul jumps right into talking about God's people, right into talking about the Israelites. Okay? So go ahead and join me in reading chapter 10. We're going to read the first five verses and then continue to dissect them until we hit to verse 22. But it's page 1017 in your pew Bibles. So let's read the first 5 verses together. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. So we are in the midst of this subsection of the book of 1 Corinthians talking about food offered to idols. If we remember in chapter 8, I got to kick this whole subsection off. Paul presented, okay, the Corinthians were struggling with, what do we do regarding food offered to idols? He's quickly segued into the idea it's not really about food, but about our spiritual freedoms. And he's reminding the church of Corinth how important it is to use our spiritual freedoms to honor God. Right? He starts this off by saying, are you unaware? Right? Are you ignorant to the fact that the Israelites went through all of this? Because if we remember, he ended chapter 9 saying this. In chapter 9, verse 25, he says, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So he's talking about, okay, this Christian walk, it takes discipline. It takes self-control. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be worth it. But immediately after saying, okay, this is what it takes, and he's saying, we don't want to be disqualified, he introduces a group of people that were disqualified. He introduces the Israelites, and he reminds us, okay, what happens when we, like the Israelites, or we, like the church of Corinth, lose sight of what matters? The idea of that is spiritual pride. When it consumes us, it will sink our ship. And pretend that we are the vessel, we are the ship. It'll sink us, just like it sunk the Titanic. So the Israelites were consumed by this, and they neglected the freedom that God gave them. So our hope, as we dissect this, is that we can learn from the mistakes of the past. We won't be consumed by the same thing. So today what I want to do is from our text, I want to pull 3 things that we can do to avoid the destruction that pride can bring. The first thing I want to look at is we can learn, or we can reflect on the mistakes. We can reflect on the mistakes that came before us. History is hundreds of thousands of lessons that we can learn from. And hundreds of thousands of people who lived before us, who made mistakes time and time again. But are we going to care, and are we going to learn from those mistakes? Are we going to become better because of those mistakes? So as you see, Paul, he jumps into chapter 10, and he's quickly, and we know he wrote this all in one sitting. But as we look at chapter 10, we see, okay, he's quickly recapping events from the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers that we can read. He talks about a cloud. Right? He talks about the cloud and Israel, the Israelites being delivered through a cloud and out of the land of Egypt. And he talks about the sea. That's the Red Sea that Moses brought them through. And we see food. That's the same spiritual food, the manna that God provided from heaven. And the spiritual rock, God provided them with water. But however, all these things happened to the Israelites. That didn't change what happened. They took these things for granted. And they still turned away from God. They still turned back to idolatry. They turned to the things of this world. Despite God freeing them from Egypt, they turned back to sin. They turned back to sin. So he says in verse 5, Paul says this, with most of them God was not pleased, and they were overthrown in the wilderness. God helped the Israelites in this way. God helped them so much. And I know a lot of us, we like to sit and say, okay, if God worked this way in my life, I would never doubt him again. I would never lose sight of the mission, right? If God provided my rent, I would never doubt him. If I saw God restore that relationship, I would never doubt him. If God healed my back, I would never doubt him. We can say that stuff, but the Israelites are a prime example that no, we can see God work clearly, yet we'll still choose sin. We'll still fall into the temptation. What I want to do is okay, why is Paul bringing up the Israelites? So to remind you, we're in our subsection on food. Okay, and the Corinthians are falling into the same traps that the Israelites were. I got Deuteronomy chapter 32 up on the screen. I got a few verses I want to read. Go ahead, throw those up there if we got them. Yeah, so this is from Deuteronomy 32, verses 16 and 17, talking about the Israelites. And tell me if this sounds familiar to what we've been talking about in Corinthians. It says, they stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that there was no gods, to gods that they had never known, to new gods that they had come up with recently, whom your fathers have never dreaded. Right? We see the Israelites are examples, and the Corinthians are falling into the same trap. They're going to the temples. They're eating food that has been offered to idols. They're worshiping idols. And we see what ultimately happens to them in our next verse. We skip up to verse 20. It says, this is God talking. He said, I will hide my face from them, and I will see what their end will be, for they are a perverse generation, children in whom no faithfulness. The Israelites disqualified themselves. They fell off course. They lost what God wanted them to do. And Paul is reminding us that, hey, this is our responsibility to acknowledge that no one is above stumbling. No one is above letting spiritual pride take control of us. Because the Israelites, they fell to idolatry. They saw God work in all these amazing ways, yet they still turned to other gods, to false gods, whom we know there are no, those idols, there's nothing behind them, but they still turned to them anyway, because that's what they were used to when they were under Pharaoh's reign in Egypt. They went back to what was comfortable. They fell to idolatry. God delivered them from Egypt. God freed them. Yet they still turned back. They took the freedom God gave them and they threw it back at God's face. That's a reminder for us. God has freed us from so much more. Not only has he freed us from Egypt, he's freed us from sin. But yet we still turn that freedom he's given us and we throw it back at his face. And most likely you're sitting here and you're like, okay, the Israelites, they were led by a cloud. They were baptized by Moses. They were fed spiritual food. That's not me. That's not me. Well, let's continue reading and see if this sounds more like us. Let's pick up in verse 7. It says, do not be idolaters as some were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat, drink, and rose up to play. Verse 8, we must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by the serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyers. This warning here, do not be idolaters as some of them were. Don't be idolaters. And that's easy to say. It's like, okay, we don't make carved images. Hopefully we don't bow down to them at home. But what are we elevating to a status that doesn't deserve to be there? Idolatry, loosely put, is a worship of something that was created as opposed to worshiping the Creator. Right? It's placing anything where God belongs, placing anything above God. And this is my warning for all of us. Don't love the freedoms that God has given us more than the one who gave us that freedom. Don't love the freedom more than the one who gives freedom. Right? Don't love the things that are created more than the Creator, because that's when idolatry comes in. What our spiritual pride does is it tells us we're beyond a point of struggling with idolatry. I'm beyond that point. I don't idolize things. But that's what we're going to look at today, is Paul's going to tell us to take heed of these warnings and to look out, because no one is beyond stumbling. No one is. The Israelites saw God work. The church of Corinth, they got Paul there, the man himself, starting a church, and they still fell off course. So certainly at a church led by me and Pastor Keith, you guys are going to fall off course super easy. So that's the warning, right? Take heed, right? The Corinthians, they turned against God, or Paul warns us against immorality. He parallels with the Israelites. We know that Corinth was a deeply sexual culture. If you went to the temples, there were probably prostitutes there, and it was a very prostitute-heavy culture. It was integrated into it. So sexual immorality was huge. The city's wealth and trade hub status fostered a climate where prostitution was common. But what Paul is doing is he's pointing out what the Corinthian church was guilty of and comparing it to the Israelites. He's saying, hey, you're both seeking idolatry at the temples. You're both falling to the same thing. And the warning is not only for the church of Corinth, but the warning is for us. Are we falling to the same things? Are we falling to idolatry? Right? Sure, idolatry and immorality, it looks different today than it used to. Right? It's easy for us to compare ourselves to them and say, okay, I don't struggle in that. Right? I don't bow down and worship, I don't make sacrifices to huge idols. But where are we spending our time? Where are we spending our money? What are we using our thoughts on? What is controlling us? What has become an idol? What have we put in the place of God that we might not have even realized? And then you're saying, okay, sure, I don't go to the temples and have sex with prostitutes. I don't do that. Right, hopefully not. But what websites are we going to when no one's looking? What are your eyes looking at when you're in social places? What are we? Because sin looks different, but it's the same. Perhaps you've honestly examined yourself and you're like, okay, idolatry and immorality, these aren't things I struggle with. And that's right where the devil wants you. He wants you to think you're beyond struggling. You're beyond that point where you can fall into this temptation. Because right when you get there, that's where pride takes root. And that's when we become the people on the Titanic, living cushy lives. And that iceberg's going to come out of nowhere and sink us. We always have to be leaning on God and who God is. I got a quote from preacher Jack Arnold. He says this. He says, apparently, some of the Christians at Corinth had become smugly secure in their Christian life. They were abused, become somewhat careless and reckless in their Christian conduct. Furthermore, they were not very interested in pursuing a life of holiness. So Paul exhorts them to get on with the Christian race, lest they be disqualified. Paul uses Israel as an example, as an illustration of a whole generation which was disqualified from the spiritual race because of godless conduct. The question is, where do you sit? Where are you right now? Is this something that you struggle with spiritual pride? Are things creeping up? Because we can get so content with where we are. Things are going to creep up on us, so we might not even realize. But the reminder, and we read it in verse 6, says, now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Winston Churchill is famous for saying, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Are we going to learn from history? Are we going to learn from the examples that came before us? Because this word example, if we look at it, in the original language, it comes from the word tupos, which literally means like a visible mark or an impression. And one other time we can see tupos used, it's used multiple times, but another time you can see tupos used is when Thomas goes to Jesus and he wants to see the imprint on his body. That same word for imprint is used here for example. I like that idea, like it's this visible mark on God's people. These are examples. Are we going to learn from the examples that the Corinthians were, or from the Israelites? And we see him double down. These things happened to them as an example, but they are written down for your instruction. They're written down for us, on whom the end of the ages has come. Brothers and sisters, the huge difference between the Israelites and us is that, yes, the Israelites were delivered from slavery, but Christ has come. Christ has delivered us from sin. Through the cross, that freedom is so much greater than what the Israelites experienced. Yet we still fall. We still fail to learn from their example. They were like, we're God's chosen people. We're going to be okay. Yet they fell to idolatry. Prayer is that we don't fall to the same things, because they too succumb to sin. You could be sitting there thinking, okay, I'm okay. Right? I'm not struggling with idolatry. I'm not going to fall into I'm not going to let spiritual pride take control of me. But that's exactly where the enemy wants you. He wants you comfortable in your freedoms. He wants you content with the blessings that surround you. He wants you excited with the circumstances you're in. And all that will do is will lure you into this feeling of, okay, I'm okay. I don't need to take heed. I'm spiritually fine. I don't need to read my Bible. I need to be in prayer. God's got me here. He'll continue to carry me through. I'm sure the Israelites thought the same thing. But we're not. We're not in a position. No one is too good to fall. Temptation will come for us all. And the question is right now, is the freedoms that you have, are the freedoms that you have they become an idol in some way? Have you put the gifts God has given you above the giver of those gifts? It's a time for self-examination, because we don't want to realize that we've been fostering an iceberg. We don't want to think we don't want to become spiritually smug and get content at where we are. So what do we do? What do we do when we feel that knocking at our door? When we feel temptation coming? That leads us to our second point is we need to resist by all means. We need to resist by all means. Verse 12 says this. It says, therefore, let anyone who thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. We need to recognize that anyone can fail. Anyone can fall. The Israelites were led by Moses. They saw the 10 plagues brought to life. They saw God part the Red Sea. God brought manna down from heaven. You'd assume that if anyone would not turn away from God, it would be these people. Yet they did. They turned away from God. And this is a great reminder for the moment that I stop and think how great I'm doing, how good of a position I'm in. That's right when I'll fall flat on my face. The reminder here is to take heed. And that basically means to keep your eyes open. Keep your eyes open. Don't lose sight of the things going on around you. We need to take heed. We need to beware. Because 1 Peter 5:8 tells us that we need to be sober-minded. Because your adversary, the devil, prowls like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. The devil wants to devour us. The worst thing we can do is create a door that lets him do that. Remain humble. Remain humble with where God's put you. Don't get so prideful in your position. Got to remain humble because no one is beyond temptation. There will always be temptation. Right? The Israelites, they thought they were doing great, but they turned away. We can do the same thing. That's a reminder is temptations will come. Temptations will come. There's no promise that God will dissolve temptation. He says this, though, in verse 13, Paul writes, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. Temptations have been present since the garden. They'll be present till Jesus comes back. And sure, temptations look different today than they did in the 1970s, but temptations are still here. And Ecclesiastes reminds us there's nothing new under the sun. So we can be like, oh, the world is going down the drain. But nothing changes. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But what this reminder shows us in 13, no temptation has overtaken us that is not common to man, is that we're not alone in our temptation. The temptation we experience, it's not unique to me. The devil likes to think that you're alone in your struggle. But that's where he wants you to be. Right? If you're struggling with something, it's our pride that says, hey, I'm beyond this. I shouldn't be fighting this sin. I shouldn't be fighting this temptation. I'm a leader in a church. I'm a leader in a small group. That's where the devil wants us to be. He wants us to think we're alone. These temptations, they're common. Everyone goes through this. No temptation that you experience is unique. And that's why it's so important for us to share our struggles with each other, to lean on each other, to build each other up. Because the devil wants you to think, okay, you're the only one struggling with spiritual doubt. You're the only one fighting materialism. You're the only one fighting idolatry. You're the only one fighting sexual immorality. You're the only one struggling with gossip. You're the only one struggling with laziness. You're the only one struggling with selfishness, with alcohol, with drugs. You're the only one. But you're not. You're not alone. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. And yes, there are consequences for the sins that we choose to engage in. But we need to bring that to other people. We need to bring that to God. Because what that will do is it'll grow like mold and it will take over. Don't let this sin that we can hold on to sometimes become the idol. Become the idol we're turning back to. Turn to God. We don't want to keep our sins hidden. What we need to do is we need to remember his promise. Verse 13 continues, God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide a way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. No temptation will be able to overpower you. You will never be tempted to a point where you have to give in, Because God says, if you rely on me, there will be a way out. But we like to think, there's no way out of this. There are two truths in here that we need to remember. The temptation, one, we can endure it. We can endure the temptation. And then two, we can escape it. There is an escape. We can get out of that. But we like to think, no, there's no escape. But God is faithful. And that's what we need to lean on him. And leaning on him will help us master this idea that we can endure it. We can escape it, but not on our own. Not left to ourselves. We need to lean on him. But God allows us to be tempted. God does. He doesn't say, I'll dissolve temptation, but I will provide a way out. I will help you get through that. So take heed. Take heed of the things around you. Seek Christ. Be in his word. Be with his people. Because take heed or we will stumble. We will fall. The last point I want to lead us to is we need to remain on mission. Because temptation will come. When temptation comes, we need to remain on mission. Let's pick back up in verse 14 of our text. It says, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak to you as sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessings that we bless, is it not a participation of the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation of Christ? Because there is one bread, and there are many, and we who are many are one body, for we partake of one bread. Verse 18, consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. So if you remember in chapter 8, Paul says food is nothing. So it seemingly feels like he's contradicting himself here, but he's not. Remember, what we're talking about is we're talking about these spiritual freedoms, and food is a good thing. Food is a gift from God. But what has happened is that food has been, by its participation in idol worship, it has become corrupted. It has become something bad. So the idea is for us to examine, okay, what maybe did God create for good that I'm corrupting? It's becoming an idol. It's been corrupted by sin. Because Paul isn't just focusing on the food, but their participation here. And just as participating in the Lord's Supper, we partake of the Lord, he's saying, hey, when you partake of other things, you're participating with demons. He's reminding us that. It's the emphasis on participation. It's more than the object itself, but it's the participation in it. And it connects the participant with something that is beyond just the physical act. We need to remember there's a spiritual realm. The things we participate in matter. And our participation in anything, regardless of what we think, it can send a spiritual message. Right? We talked about in chapter 8, if food makes my brother stumble, I'll never eat food again. If something is causing you to sin, you got to give that up. If something's causing other people to sin, that's where we're called out of love. Okay, I got to give that up too. That's why discernment is key. And then the crucial question when participating in anything is, could this cause me or someone else to stumble in our faith? Because things are going to come. Things are going to come knocking on the door. And what's our advice when that comes? So we're to run from evil. We're to run from evil. If the Corinthians struggled with idolatry, they shouldn't be hanging out near the temple. They need to run. The verse says flee, right? Don't flirt with sin, flee from sin. And this idea of flee literally means to take flight. It means to take flight, to run away from that. Right? It's like I talk about this most times when I preach. I'm trying to avoid sweets. I'm not saying sweets is a sin, but those cookies out there, I'm going to avoid them. Okay? But it would be like me saying, okay, I'm going to avoid sweets, but this fresh baked pie I'm just going to hold. yeah, I'm just going to hold it right here. It's going to be okay. I'm just going to smell it. It's going to be all right. No, what I need to do is I need to throw that pie down. I need to stomp on it. I need to flee. I need to run. I need to take flight. Okay? But we like to kind of dabble. We know aren't good for us. Maybe we know aren't good for other people. But if it's causing you to stumble, you need to flee. If it's causing your brothers and sisters in Christ to stumble, we're also called to flee. Take flight. Flee from that sin. And this fleeing means like we got to deny ourselves. We're drawn to these things. They're crafted in a way that's going to tempt us. In Luke 9, that if anyone, this is Jesus talking, if anyone were to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily. We need to deny our flesh. We need to flee from fleshly desires. And denying our sinful desires, if we're fleeing from something, we got to be running towards something else. So we can flee from sin. That means nothing if we're not running towards Jesus. Take flight. Flee from the sin that is in your life and run towards Christ. Because that sin is that iceberg. It's coming for you. And God is a lifeboat. We need him to be saved. And how do we do this? How do we flee? Is we need to rely on his strength, not our own. We need to lean on him. Because I know on my own I can do nothing. But I need to lean on him. Not only him, but the people here. God has given us a family here at Village Bible Church. Are we utilizing this family God's given us? Are we joining a small group? Are we sharing our struggles with each other? Because that sin, it'll dwell in darkness. It'll take root. And your pride will tell you, I'm beyond that point. I shouldn't be struggling with this. I'll deal with it on my own, and then we can move forward. No. We need to flee from that idolatry. Don't hold on to it. Don't hold on to the sin that is keeping you captive. It's important to remember what are we representing? Remind ourselves who we represent in this world. What are we participating in? Verse 21, you cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You can't have it both ways. You can't have both sides. A good image I like to think of is a train. I like to think of a train on a bridge. What we like to do is we're the train, and we're on the bridge, and we like to go over here some days, and we like to go over here some days. Right? What are we participating in? Or we're not picking a side. We're going left. We're going right. But everything we do has spiritual implications. Every bad choice is made from 100 little bad ones. Every great fall comes from 100 little bad decisions. We need to rewire our mind and honor Christ with every decision. So this bridge, we like to go between both sides. But what we don't realize is this side's rigged with a bomb, and the bridge itself is rigged with a bomb, and the only way is this side, is Christ. We can't go both sides. We need to seek Christ full-heartedly. But we like participating in different things. We deem our freedoms more important than fully going towards Christ. We like to hold on to things that make us happy in this world, completely neglecting the eternal world, completely neglecting heaven. That's the challenge, is how do we examine ourselves and what things have become an idol that maybe we don't even realize. I was challenged by Pastor Keith a few weeks ago. I love movies. I like watching movies a ton, and if you ever talk to me, I'd probably bring up a movie. But what I realized is not only did I like movies, but I think I loved them. I think movies and the art of filmmaking had become an idol in some way for me. And that took Keith acknowledging that and other leaders at our church acknowledging that. And that took me to say, you're right. That is something I'm convicted on. That is something I need to be challenged on. The thing is, what in your life has been elevated to that status that it shouldn't be at? God has worked in our lives. I've seen God work in my life. God has given us this freedom from sin. But we crawl back to it, and not always in the most obvious form. but in a form where it's a good thing that has been corrupted by a bad thing. What are those things in our life? And are we going to take heed, and are we going to look out? The reminder, we need to stay on mission. And what is our mission? If we jump back to chapter 9:19, Paul said this, "For though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them." The mission is the gospel. The mission is a proclamation of the gospel and seeking and saving the lost. That's our mission. And if watching less movies means winning more people to Christ, then amen. That's worth it. But it took someone to acknowledge that, and for me to acknowledge that, say, okay, remain on mission. Don't lose sight of what matters. Don't lose sight of what God needs you to do. Because our mission is to live with discipline and intentionality that leads people to Christ. That's what's most important. And that's why Paul is saying, hey, I can give up these things. I can give up my spiritual freedoms because I want to win people to Christ. That is what's most important. That's the challenge, to be challenged by this. We read in verse 22, closing out our text for today. It says, "Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than him?" It's a rhetorical question. Paul knows we're not stronger than him. But why do we put God to the test? Why do we continue to turn back to things that aren't him? We're provoking him to jealousy. Right? We don't play with matches unless you want to start a fire in some way. Don't mess around with things that can get you into more trouble. Flee from those. Run, take flight. And I want to look at an example that can be read in Hebrews chapter 10. The writer of Hebrews, we'll look at Hebrews 10, verse 26. The writer of Hebrews says this regarding the Israelites. It says, "For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins." Verse 27, "But a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries." Hebrews 10:28, "Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much more punishment do you think will be deserved when the one who has trampled under the foot of the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified?" That's harsh language. Trampled on the Son of God. That's what we do when we turn back to these things that aren't honoring God. We are trampling on the blood of Jesus. Jesus died for us. He's given us freedom from sin. But for some reason, that pie is just so tasty. We need to flee from that, and we need to take heed, and we need to run towards Jesus. That's the only way to flee idolatry. We need to lean on him, because God is a jealous God. It's easier for us to fall into the trap. Okay, Ethan, I'm good. Right? That's great, all this take heed stuff. I'm okay. That's a warning. No one is above temptation. No one is above falling. Right? Flee idolatry. Run towards God. The God that we serve is infinitely powerful. He's given us a sacrifice for our sins through Jesus, through Jesus' blood, through his death, burial, and resurrection. He's given us hope. But we turn away from that hope, just like the Israelites. We need to learn from their examples. Right? They failed, so we don't have to. We're going to learn from that. Right? Flee from the idols in our life. Right? We need to take heed. We need to be humble. We need to realize no one's beyond stumbling. No one's beyond falling. Because just like the Titanic, just like the creators of the Titanic and the people aboard the Titanic, like, we're living life. We're doing great. An iceberg came out of nowhere, and hundreds have died. Hundreds died. That's a warning. Take heed. We don't want to stumble. We don't want to lose sight of what is important. That's winning people to Christ. That's what God calls us to do. And Paul is highlighting how important this is. I just wanted to hit each and every one of us how important it is. And what mission am I living? And if you find yourself living a life that is off mission, turn back to Christ. That train, the bridge, and the end are going to blow up. The only thing that won't is Christ. Seek him and heed the warnings. Take heed.